Andrea is a great friend of BC Tech and likely needs no introduction, but I'll embarrass her with praise anyway. She's an adjunct professor at UBC. She's a former Vancouver City Councillor. She's a recent graduate of Harvard, and she's one of the most interesting thinkers in British Columbia, and I find every conversation with her a real delight. She's a partner with me in wanting to change the envelope and build a progressive future here in BC. So we couldn't be joined by a better person. Welcome, Andrea.
Thanks, Jill. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Would you mind giving our audience just a brief introduction to yourself and to how you got interested in this work? And then we'll work our way through some questions. And of course, people may also ask questions in the chat, and then I'll just raise those with you. But first, give us a bit of an introduction.
Sure. Well, you guys heard some of the recent highlights of what's been going on in my life. I spent 4 terms in local government. Prior to that, I worked on advocacy out in the community, primarily on environment, but also on issues around social justice and democratic access and sort of how they all intersected, as well as community economic development. I spent time in local government, and then it's a bit of a hard, when people talk about why they run for office or why they decide to leave office, they tend to give it to you in like these short sound bites. Nothing actually works that way in the real world. Like there's a lot of factors that conflate. But certainly the election of Trump in the United States was a moment for me to pause and reflect about how this project of my theory of change, that you could work through democratic governance and that people have the capacity to reason and they would all reason together and come up with good decisions, that maybe there were some flaws in that structure if someone like Donald Trump could get elected. And this isn't meant as a pro or con his politics, but this idea that reason itself had sort of somehow fallen by the wayside in democracies. So I decided not to run again, got the fellowship at Harvard, and got the opportunity to learn from and teach there. Part of my fellowship was a teaching component, and to really dive into power literacy. It really sort of uncovered for me that you can understand government really well, just like you can understand tech business really well. If you don't understand power well, you are always going to get beaten by people who do understand it well. And frankly, the people who do tend to be acting in their self-interest, and the people who don't understand it, most people are trying to create common good, right? And so I felt like that's where I could bring something to bear, how I got into the ideas around power literacy and how implicit bias is. It's kind of like a secret weapon we're all holding in our back pocket that we don't know that we're holding. And if we're not conscious about that, then we can do a lot of damage with it.
Well, that's a topic that's worth unpacking a little more. So we will definitely come back to the question of power literacy. I'm fascinated by that. But let's start by thinking a bit and unpacking this concept of bias. So what is implicit bias and how does it differ from explicit bias? Can you help us unpack those terms?
Yeah, for sure. So, I've been greatly aided in the work I've been doing by what's going on in the world around us right now. There's a lot of very live discussion around this. Explicit bias would be a stated belief that you believe that based on your values and your belief structure, you believe that people of a different race or different gender or even a different country are lesser than you, that you hold a bias against them, or even, you could put that a different way, you hold a bias for people who are like you. Most people's explicit bias aligns with themselves, right? So men will hold an explicit bias for men, women will hold an explicit bias for women. Implicit bias is when you have a preference for a skin color, a gender, sexual preference, sexual identity, that is, you hold it within a series, a neural network within your brain of implicit association. Sorry, we've already dived into the science. And oftentimes it's against your explicit beliefs. So you may explicitly believe that you're not racist, and you're not. Your values and beliefs are well aligned in an idea that all people are created equal, but your implicit bias, the associations in your brain, are a product of culture, not your conscious thought. So if your culture tells you that people with darker skin are less than people with lighter skin, you have a series of pathways in your brain that every time you see someone with darker skin, you're less likely to hire them. You're less likely to promote them. You're more likely to clutch your purse or walk to the other side of the street or something, even though explicitly you don't hold those values or beliefs at all.
So do we all suffer from this then? If it's a product of culture, do we all suffer from it? Do you suffer from it? Do you have implicit bias?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a project out of Harvard called Project Implicit. You can go, if you Google out Project Implicit, you can find dozens of tests you can take, implicit association tests. They work, the idea of them is that you're moving fast enough and making decisions in the test that it's using your unconscious brain as opposed to your conscious brain. When I took the test for the first time, and I'll warn you, most people take the test and they're like, I don't have this doesn't exist in me, right? It can be very hard to confront it. I am an Indigenous woman. I have actually a fairly strong bias against Indigenous women, which makes sense because 100% of the media that I consume passively, like the news media, the Netflix shows I watch, the books I read, the social media, talks about Indigenous women as less than other people. Like the most common adjectives for Indigenous women are missing and murdered, right? Those are not adjectives that you associate with strong, powerful, intelligent, capable. So my implicit bias actually is against me, and that's actually fairly common. Women will generally think of women as weaker because that's the cultural training that we've been given. So think of your implicit biases as the hardware. The cool thing is that we get to decide the software that runs on it. So you can retrain your brain to go in a different direction. So to give you an example of that, I have a child who's transgender, was assigned a gender at birth and therefore a pronoun that goes along with that gender. When they were in their early teens, they came out as transgender, and suddenly, this is a very tough thing. Like, if you idea of having to change their name or their pronoun, your brain has a deeply worn path around the one you think it is. It took me about a year to reprogram it. There's a variety of tools you use. So I didn't know a lot of transgender people at the time, did not have a lot of proximity to transgender people. Well, apparently had a lot of proximity from my child's whole life, but didn't have adults, people in my adult professional life. So more proximity to them, consumed a lot more media that had positive depictions of transgender people, like sort of normal depictions, and also set up a pronoun jar in our house. So every time I misgendered my child, I had to put money in it, which was a good strategy for them. They got financially better off as a result of it. But it's more that it forced my brain, every time my brain went down the path I didn't want it to go down, it was a way of going, no, I want you to go on this other path. So now I actually have trouble calling anyone in that age range by a she or him pronoun, because my brain is so trained to go to the they path every time I see someone in that age range, right? So it's not just possible, it's actually very easy to do, but it's that intentionality. You need to uncover what your biases are and then work to be biased.
Okay, so it's a bad news, good news story.
Right.
We all have these implicit biases, but once we know what they are, there are things we can do about it. And I remember when you sent me to that project, and I filled in the survey, I was so aware of how effortful it was to not display bias, and that in itself was a learning. I was unwilling to fail this test, Andrea, but it actually took effort to give unbiased answers, and I thought, oh, that's the problem. So you start by finding out what your biases are, and then you work out techniques and ways that you can address those. And as you're saying, it's effortful, but it does work. Is there anything well, I guess we'll get into this in much more depth, right, in September. But is there anything that a quick tip perhaps that you could leave with our audience today? If people were impatient to get started, what would you encourage them to do to start their own work in this area?
Yeah, well, I would say, I'm guessing a lot of you read a lot of social media, like you've got articles you're clicking on and different things that you're consuming to help inform your worldview. We're in a time when much is changing constantly. I think if you were to check it, might not be true for all of you, but I'm guessing that the vast majority of articles you're reading are written by white men between a certain age range and from certain parts of the world. I would challenge you to go find an article on exactly the same topic written by a woman or a racialized person or an indigenous person, or from a different continent. So look for maybe white viewpoints from Europe, right, to see how they're different from the ones that we're getting here. It's actually hard to do because your filter bubble is filtering you into certain streams, and those streams are pretty heavily demographically populated. But once you step just a little outside, the good news is you're now in a new whole world, right? And it's amazing how much it expands your viewpoint. It's not that one is good and one is bad. It's that it allows you, the same way you wouldn't want a company populated by, imagine if you could only choose employees from a narrow band of demographics. There's no way with that narrow band you're going to get the full potential of the capacity of them for preventing them to think. So it's that one find expands your universe quite dramatically. Trying to find a Netflix show that is not produced or directed by a white man is actually quite an astounding thing to do. It's difficult to do. But again, I'm just like Black Panther, like totally changed the way that we viewed a certain genre of movie. I think you'll look shows that you track from different perspectives also create that roundedness in the way you look at the world.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic. You've given us a couple of positive, actionable steps that we can take even from this sort of limited exploration. This, of course, we're working in the tech industry. And I'm just curious, do you suspect that those of us who are working in the tech industry would struggle with this more than other industries, less than other industries, just the same? Is there anything that you'd expect that you might see when you do your deep dive with our tech audience in September?
That is a good question. I might expect it just a little bit more. Like I do think, and I'm speaking sort of US, Canada, it's not necessarily a global perspective, but I think in US and Canada, access to riskier, like if you're looking for riskier investments, so you're looking for money that's willing to take those risks, you're more likely to see that in a narrow band of demographics. Like, are people going to take a risk on an indigenous woman versus a white man who has a certain life experience? So even if both of us graduated from the same university and had almost the same resume, I suspect the white man would seem like less risky, right? But then considering that my very first educational experience was at 47, at Harvard. I mean, it was Harvard, so there's that. But nonetheless, I think then you see this vast gap in access. I know you see this in the cannabis world as well, right? Like people, like it's just easier to get investment if you come from a more dominant culture demographic. So I think that you will see that challenge. I think as the industry matures, you're going to see that less and less, but this is a way of sort of speeding that up, right? To start actively debiasing now.
Yeah, I'll be really interested to see how it goes. I mean, in many ways, we really do understand the value of diverse points of view, at least when building products. So we've got that going for us. On the other hand, we're really keen on cultural fit.
Yeah.
And that's another way of saying, be similar to me. so I'll be really interested to see what happens when we dive into it. Listen, how did you get involved in this work? So what's the path that caused you to say, this is important to me and I want to go a bit deeper?
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, I'm going to use a strange metaphor, which is traffic accident, but in policymaking, I've been involved as a policymaker as sort of when I was much younger, a grassroots activist, a sort of professional advocate and policymaker as I got older, and then like actually as a member of government, right? Both at City Council and the school board in Vancouver. I was appointed to be the world's local government representative at the United Nations on environment issues and work nationally on things. So, I've been in a lot of different policymaking environments, and over again, it's the same traffic accident. It's like when you stand at an intersection that's built poorly and you're watching the same almost accident happen over and over. The same thing happens in policy, and it is about power literacy. People come and they show up, and they don't realize how much power they have. And they what's the phrase, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory? It happens so often in policymaking, right? We're looking nationally at a government is scoring goals on itself left, right, and center right now, right? And so this is about power literacy and not understanding power. And then the close cousin of that is implicit bias. I actually would argue what's happening nationally right now, Morneau and Trudeau, is a lot more about them not understanding the privilege they have and what it looks like from the outside, right? So I felt like what I could bring to bear is some power doesn't like you talking about power, right? It's like a guild, and you're not supposed to talk about nobody wants to know how the sausage gets made. The reality is, in democracies, everyone wants to know maybe you don't want to know how the sausage gets made, but you want to know you could know how the sausage gets made, right? So I think this idea of talking about power, talking about implicit bias, implicit bias is by far and away the number one reason I see policy discussions go poorly. Jody Wilson-Raybould, I mean, that's the whole discussion there, but a lot of implicit bias in their discussion right now around structural racism is all about implicit bias and power. So anyway, I felt like if I was willing to go out and talk about this, maybe it would generate some discussions. It's not that I have any brilliant to say, it's that I'm willing to say it. And I think I'd like to see other people be willing to say it as well.
Fantastic. It's an area that I'm, really interested in myself, right? Sort of unpacking the concept of power. I remember once, this was a few years ago, and someone was pressing for me to approve something. And they said, can you just look at it? Because we really need your approval. And I said, yeah, I don't know that it has my approval, right? And they said, oh, well, we really need you to approve it. I said, is no an acceptable answer to you? And they said, well, we really want to get to yes. And I said, well, just go ahead without me then. But I can't give you a yes, But it was a fascinating, in what sense do you have the right to approve something if there's only one answer you can give?
Right.
I thought that was a really interesting dialogue around that. So when you think about the concept of power literacy, especially for sort of the people on the call, and I'm certainly trying to advance things in the policy sphere, right? Advocating for a particular kind of tech-enabled future in British Columbia, that we should be doing a lot to support small, medium-sized businesses adopt technology and thrive in a digital future. Is there any advice you would give me on how to best leverage my power for good, of course, right, to achieve good social ends?
Yeah, well, so I teach a course at UBC about power. I'm like halfway through it right now, and I'm like, oh, how would I condense the last 18 hours down into 18 teaching hours down into one thing? I guess the first and most critical thing is being aware of power and power in the room. And when I say power, I think most people, when the word power comes into our head, we think about people we perceive as having power, and those people tend to be positional power. So a president, a prime minister, a CEO, like people who have the title, the sort of rank authority. That is one of 6 kinds of power. And of the 6 kinds, the sort of 6 broad categories of power, it is one of the 3 that we actually give to people. So we give them those titles. You may not personally have handed Donald Trump the title of president, but we decide that there is a person called the president. In our case, a prime minister. We decide that prime minister has a certain level of authority and power over us. But we can also take away that power, right, from the person. But even in a country like Venezuela right now, there's even an open dialogue about whether the title president has authority, right? So it's a social contract, essentially. Your authority, your power as an expert, they can't take that away from you. There's a reason that authoritarian regimes go after science first, because they can take away your title, they can take away your reward and coercion power, they cannot take away your expertise. Similarly, referent networks, so unions, that's another, so expert and referent are the two big ones in the non-social contract. These are all yours. And then the third one in that category is the title of it is spiritual, but iconic examples of people when told things are a certain way, they're like, that is not how I experience this, and I'm not willing to believe that that's true. My truth is different, and I'm willing to assert that truth. I think all of us, I mean, I hear this with women a lot, where we, we get othered in male space, dominantly male spaces. We get interrupted. Our ideas get stolen. These are common daily occurrences for women. So then you have to decide: am I going to admit that's happening? Because the minute you admit that it's happening, you actually admit that you are this idea of living in the truth is actually a fairly critical one in power. Anyway, it's all to say that if you walk into a meeting with someone with authority and you believe giving away your power, all the power you came into that room with, your expertise, your maybe you have the ability to reward that person with authority with a vote or a block of votes or money or something, right? If you come in and believe that because your title is less than, you've just left it all on the table, essentially. Even if you go in thinking you're slightly less than, you're leaving a lot off the table. So figuring out how to have you recognize your own authority and then get literate about the fact that you have it and then competent with it is really what I try to work
on. This is what I needed to hear today. Thank you for that. And we will look out that article. I remember you sharing it with me earlier with the 6 kinds of power, and we'll share that with the people who are on the call today. I think it was a wonderful read. I just want to go to the chat because we've got a question from Miranda, which is a great one. So for those who are unaware of their privilege and power, how do you approach having that conversation with them and raising that? I wonder if it sometimes clicks with others more quickly, and if for those it doesn't click with, this notion of power literacy can be overwhelming. So any tips, any firsthand experiences of how to approach that?
Yeah, no, this is definitely so of the 5, I teach 6 weeks on power. One of the full weeks is a role-playing game. So of the 5, that's actual teaching content. An entire week I do on timing. So 6 hours just to teach people about timing and when the right time is, because it's exactly like a business, right? Just like there's a right time to do different things in a business environment, there's a right time to confront people or be provocative, or there's a teachable moment around privilege and power. I would argue that it is like a virus response, right? If you go at the wrong time, you're actually creating a double resistance to it. So the next time you try, it's twice as hard. So I'm making it sound impossible. It's not at all. It's just knowing when that moment is, right? Right now in society, there is a huge moment to have a discussion around. That's why we're having this discussion, right? When we wouldn't have had it maybe 6 months ago, people would have been like, why are we even talking about this, right? Even if they perceive there's a problem. So it's figuring out when the right time is. It's having the right tools, right? What is the language of power? I was in class the other day. There was a moment where there was a very teachable moment, and I asked this guy, I was like, you'll notice of the 6 people who spoke first, 5 of them were white men in a class that only has five white men, right? Out of 40 people. So it's a moment to have a discussion about power, right? But it was a moment for the men, they viewed it as a shaming moment. I was like, no, what about the other 25 of you? You've all left your power on the table. You all could have stepped up. There was nothing stopping you from speaking in this moment. And yet you chose to wait for them, right? Which is there's a whole discussion there too, right? Anyway, as we're talking, the men talked about how they were feeling about it. And one of them said, well, I'm very aware of my privilege. And I said, would you have told me that 10 years ago? And he stopped and he's like, no, because I didn't know what to call it. So even just having this language makes it possible for us to have, so that's where I would start. Like if you can't start with confronting the power dynamics or the privilege, you can start with like, hey, there's this really cool article I read that has these 6 types of power in it. Have you read this yet? Like, and that's the beginning to start having that language to discuss it with.
That's fabulous. I just want to close us off, and the time has absolutely flown with you.
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
I am excited that we are going to do this deeper dive in September. I really feel like we've barely scratched the surface of the conversation. But let's just close off with this question from Anne, which I think is excellent. So just staying on this question of the surface, the question of privilege and power, and draw someone's attention to their privilege, perhaps. What do you do if the conversation goes in a bit of a defensive direction? What's the best thing to do in that moment?
Yeah, well, this is pretty, this is the challenge, right? It's like when you provoke I'm going to call it the virus response, but I feel like we all have become very educated about viruses these days. So we have common language around it. I don't have a simple answer. I do have it sits next to me on my desk, not just when I do interviews on this, but it's a book by Shakil Chowdhury called Deep Diversity. There's fantastic, it's very accessible language in the book, and it takes them about 2 chapters to answer your question, but I think it's worth reading if you're wanting to take this on in a bigger way in your life, because I think the potential of all of us is so much higher if we can act to our full capacity without having to either be limited from that action or limiting ourselves because we fear what might happen if someone's privilege is weaponized against us.
I think that's so key. Just getting yourself prepared and equipping yourself with some tools and some things you could say just builds your confidence in even approaching the topic in the first place. So we'll capture that book recommendation from you as well so that we can share that afterwards. Well, I am sorry to say our time is at an end because that was really a lot of fun. Thank you again, Andrea, for coming on and chatting to us.